Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever I'm finding you in the world. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is IDAGIO's Fred Plotkin on Fridays, in which I talk about inspiration and music and other things with people who inspire me. In some cases, I've known them my whole lives. In other cases, such as today's guest, I've never met him, but his work has inspired me for decades. We have José Serebrier, who is a lifelong, I think your career is some 70 plus years, uh, conductor, composer, man of music, citizen of the musical world. And so I welcome you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to speaking with you.
You were born in Montevideo in Uruguay, and I guess the term, I don't know if you used it, was child prodigy. Your musical gifts revealed themselves very early, and you were performing, you were studying, you were composing, conducting at a very young age. What are your earliest memories of being made aware, perhaps by yourself, perhaps by others, of your musical gifts?
I was never really aware of musical gifts. I just enjoyed it. It was just the pleasure of making music. I started to study music late by most musicians' standards. Most professional musicians are started by their parents when they're 3 or 4, sometimes late on at 5, with exceptions. I was an exception. When I was a child, there wasn't even a record player, LP in those days, in my home. So I discovered music, classical music, by listening to the radio one day, and I thought I was mesmerized, and I bought myself with my own money a violin when I was 9. And I immediately looked up the repertoire, which I love, but I thought it was too limited, the solo violin repertoire, even to this day perhaps, compared to the orchestral repertoire, which is enormous. So a year later, I decided I'll better be a conductor. And I organized my own orchestra when I was 11. By then I was an old man of 11. I went to see the Minister of Culture in short pants, who received me. Today I find it incredible. And he took me seriously. He said, well, there is no tradition of youth orchestras or amateur orchestras in South America in those days. We are talking way back. So I said, can I go from school to school and ask different young players, young people if they play instruments? He said, sure, I'll give you a letter to allow you to miss classes so you can go around. I found nearly 100 players, and we formed an orchestra. That's how it started.
Well, that sounds unusually easy.
It was lots of work.
I know that Uruguay is a small country. I've been there, and I want to talk to you about Uruguay later. But it, even in a small country, and Montevideo is a lovely city, but there must be a longer version of that story of how, number one, when did you learn to read music, that you were able to look at violin music and then orchestral music and decide that one was perhaps more appealing to you than the other? And then how did you find musicians, these other 11-year-olds like yourself, who were in these different schools?
First of all, they were older than me. Most of the performers, players, were anywhere from 13 to 18. I was the youngest one in the group. High school kids, they were early college even. How I found them, I went from school to school and I asked to speak to the classes. And I don't remember every detail, but before I knew it, we had 95 to 100 players. Then the Ministry of Culture found us a place to rehearse, and somehow we found music. The first concert there is a photograph of that which appears from time to time of me conducting them in the university main hall. I don't know how I arranged that. And I had the nerve to invite the president of Uruguay. And he wrote back, sometimes I read a mail, and he wrote back saying, could we include my whole cabinet? They will have to come. So there is this fantastic picture or the president and the whole cabinet to his side, and I'm with short pants conducting. Orchestra and choir. We had a choir as well. And then because I didn't know enough about it, I didn't know anything about the business of that, I asked the orchestra to memorize. It was Bach suite number 2 and 3, if you can imagine. And they had to memorize it. So in the picture, you can see one of the cello players, because it's taken from that side. He didn't memorize it, but he tricked me. He put the music in the chair in front of him with thumb tags. So he could play from music, but I thought it was memory. So they played and I conducted from memory. Incredible. Now there is an orchestra in London these days. I don't remember the name of the orchestra that plays everything from memory. They copied my my style, but in those days it was incredible. But we rehearsed for like 4 months. So the most difficult part to memorize are the lower strings because they're mostly repeated notes. But somehow they did it, and I did it, and it was a great. So in those days, I was just your question was how I learned to read music in my violin lessons, and then somehow I guess I was self-taught at the beginning, and then I had some of the best teachers in the world later on when I came to America. I was very lucky, but at the beginning I learned to conduct, I guess the way a child learns to walk, by falling and picking up again.
Well, I think there's more to that. We're going to get to it in a moment. But one thing that jumps out to me from your discussion is that Uruguay in the late 1940s had a minister of culture. We're about to inaugurate a new president of the United States, and we still don't have a cabinet level secretary of culture or the arts or anything like that. I'm not alone. I know you probably believe this too, in advocating for that. I would like to be the nation's first Secretary of Culture if asked, but it says so much to me about nations and their values or their awareness. Uruguay being a small country, I think the current population is only about 3 million, and yet it's bordered by the massive nations of Brazil and Argentina, maintains its identity in part because it's small, and in part because there has always been a emphasis on culture there. Also, I think it really helped that Uruguay won the first World Cup soccer tournament
Twice.
in the 1930s, twice, but it was among the first, and that put Uruguay on the world map.
Sure.
Well before Italy and Brazil won, and then other nations later on. I don't know if you're a fan, but I do follow soccer.
I play soccer.
Okay.
I have every Uruguayan plays soccer.
Yeah. It's remarkable. If you would talk about musical life in Montevideo. I've worked at the Teatro Solis, which is a lovely theater, one that most people wouldn't know if they have not been to Uruguay.
Well, Solis Teatro is older than Teatro Colón, the famous, fantastic theater in Buenos Aires, iconic theater. Teatro Solis precedes it by a quarter of a century or something. And it's a typical Italian style theater, opera theater, like horseshoe-like. And I recently, about 2 years ago, I did a benefit concert to renew it, to do some things that needed to be done. And that helped enormously. They raised a great deal of money for it. The musical life has changed over the years, but I was very lucky as a child. The musical life in Uruguay, which, as you say, is a tiny country compared to the two giants next to it, it was a very, very lively musical life. The orchestra was so good. Before I was born, I never met Erich Kleiber. Erich Kleiber, now known as the father of Carlos Kleiber,
Yes.
But in those days, he was really, with Toscanini, one of the two major conductors in the world. He had to leave Germany, and he moved to Uruguay and Argentina. He conducted Uruguay, Argentina, and I think in some other countries in Central America, probably Cuba. Those days had a very good orchestra too. And Kleiber really built the orchestra. They had a Beethoven festival every year. And I think Carlos was born either there or across the river in Buenos Aires.
In Argentina, yeah.
In Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
Then Fritz Busch came, again, before I was born, for many years. And then when I was a child, already interested in music and going to concerts, we had the most amazing array of guest conductors, staying for weeks at a time. Antal Dorati, who later on became my teacher. I never met him at that time. Paul Paré was a main conductor for a while, an amazing French conductor. Didn't last long for extra local political reasons. He then went to Detroit as a conductor at Detroit Symphony and made some of the most amazing recordings of French music. Paul Paré. Jean Martinon spent many weeks in Uruguay. I fell in love with Uruguayan pianist and married her. So that was his close ties to Uruguay. Jean Martinon later on became the conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Great, one of the great French conductors, and so on and so forth. Paul Hindemith spent weeks there. I met him there. I remember I was so tiny and he looked like a giant to me. And he said, hello and good luck or something. That's what I remember. So he conducted the concert, not only his music, but Beethoven. In fact, few people know that Hindemith wanted to have a conducting career as much as a composing career, and organized an orchestra in Turkey. He became the conductor, founder conductor of the Ankara Orchestra, still known as the Presidential Symphony Orchestra. That's the name of the orchestra, Presidential Symphony Orchestra, organized and conducted by Hindemith for many years. Anyway, I met him in Montevideo as well. And the orchestra was so good, I guess, at the time, I couldn't really judge, but so that even violinists that later on left the country and became stars around the world couldn't get into the orchestra. The audition, and they said, no, we'll come back in 5 years or something. So it was really, really very good quality. And there were chamber music concerts all the time. And I decided at one point to organize a festival of American music. I was fascinated by the contemporary American composers and older ones. This is before I ever heard of Ives. In fact, I didn't include Ives. I went to the American embassy and they cooperated. They helped me put it together. So it was live concerts and broadcast concerts. By then I was around 14 or so, but it was a long festival of around 3 months. And I discovered music by every American composer of the time. So that's the beginning. Musical life. I'm sorry about myself.
No.
Musical life in Uruguay. They brought some foreign performers. Jean-Louis Leroux, oboist, just graduated from the Conservatoire in Paris, first prize and so on. And people couldn't believe that sound. The sound of the oboe. French oboes are very special. And he started the School of Oboes. To this day, we have very good oboes thanks to Jean-Louis. Then Jean-Louis emigrated to America and became the conductor of the San Francisco Ballet Orchestra. Very good friend of mine. And they brought a few other foreigners. In addition, some great musicians came during the war, I guess, when I was just a few years old. My teachers, Guido Santorsola from Italy. He was a fantastic musical personality. He taught me composition and harmony. Vicente Ascone became the conductor of the band, local band, made it into one of the best bands in South America. He was my harmony teacher. And then a Uruguayan, Carlos Estrada, who went to study in Paris at the Conservatoire and brought the culture back to Montevideo. Violin teachers, I was so lucky. You see, I had this extraordinary violin teacher, Yasha Fidlon. Fidlon had this photograph of himself, which he displayed, he had enlarged in his study, of himself teaching Heifetz. He was hours older student, I guess, and when he was busy, when Leopold Auer, the great historic violin teacher, was busy, he asked Yasha Fidlon to help him with Heifetz. This picture was incredible. He's pointing to Heifetz violin. It's unbelievable. So he escaped once an orchestra from Russia was touring South America, and he literally escaped, asked for asylum, and asked if he could play on the second violins in the back of the orchestra, back of the row. He thought whenever they play the Mozart Symphony or Concerto, they may not need him. So that was the reason he asked to play in the back of the row. And he was I feel embarrassed today thinking that he had to listen to me play scales at the age of 9. It must have been horrible for him, but I learned so much from him. And some of his students are around the world as concertmasters in orchestras. So we were very lucky.
I think that listeners who are not in South America, because Jose, we have listeners all over the world on this broadcast, may not be aware of the depth of classical music life in South America. I have been to most of South America apart from Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. I've even been to the 3 Guyanas. And the musical life of South America is fantastic. It's a combination of European and African and local, in other words, the indigenous people of South America. And each nation has its own tradition. I know that tango, the Argentines say it's theirs, the Uruguayans say it's theirs. Somewhere on the River Plata, between the two, tango was born. And I know that Toscanini and many Italian orchestras and opera companies toured South America at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And famously, Toscanini, age 19, was a cellist in an Italian orchestra and didn't like how the conductor was conducting Aida. It was either in Rio or Sao Paulo in one of the Teatro Municipal. And Toscanini, who was pretty self-assured like you are, basically stood up and said to the conductor, "I'll conduct this." And he conducted Aida from memory at the age of 19 in Rio de Janeiro. And when you have populations that are heavily Italian, Russian, Jewish, German, all of these populations from Europe who came to the Americas for whatever reason, and not just North America, but South America, and you had civic-minded people building these magnificent theaters in Santiago, in Montevideo, in Sao Paulo, in Rio, in Buenos Aires, in Bogota, in Cartagena, in Venezuela, all over the continent, in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon in Brazil. It created a network of theaters. And to this day, the theaters cooperated. A lot of them are led by the Teatro Municipal in Chile, in Santiago, where they've produced scenery that is then used in other opera houses in South America. And when artists come to South America who are not from there, they tour the continent. And in the winter in the northern hemisphere, it's a summer in the southern hemisphere, and therefore, in reverse, it's always possible to tour South America. To what degree have you performed elsewhere in South America? What can you talk about the audiences and the differences among the nations in terms of their connection to, let's call it, classical music?
So that's a wonderful question, because all countries until recently, I guess, in South America are entirely different. Just like in Europe, Italy could be more different from Russia, and Spain could be more different from Norway, let's say. Same thing. Now with the internet and more travel, I mean, not now, but over the last 50 years, I guess, there is more and more homogeneity between all the nations in the world. Not yet, but more and more. But still, the differences in culture, in the only thing that really unites them are the language, except for Brazil. They all speak Spanish, and Brazil, of course, is Portuguese. But other than that, the differences are enormous. Between Uruguay and Argentina, which are supposed to be so similar, are entirely different in many ways. Chile too, Peru too. Now, how do I know them? Every country there intimately, since my first tour, international tour with orchestras, was a long time ago with the Juilliard Orchestra. So the president of Juilliard at the time was Peter Menin. Mm-hmm. Peter Menin, a great American composer, whom I knew from his days in Baltimore. When he was before Juilliard, he was president of the Peabody institute, music institute, and he organized this competition for conductors, for the American Conductors Project, sponsored by the Ford Foundation. And I won it 1 year together with Jimmy Levine. And it was two or three winners. And it was a wonderful thing. And then he left, Manning left for Juilliard. And as soon as he arrived in Juilliard, he called me and he said, shall we do a tour with the main orchestra with the kids that are about to graduate or just graduated? So I called my manager, who was then starting from Buenos Aires. He was starting an American office in New York, Elias Grappa, very good pianist, but decided to really succeed in the business of making other artists succeed. So he became a very important manager. To this day, is the biggest management in Latin America for classical artists. So he went to the State Department, Grappa, and hours later he came out saying, we have a tour. And they will give us an airplane, so we can stop any place all over South America. 19 cities. It was an amazing tour. So I got to know the different public that in Peru, we played in the stadium. It was such enthusiasm. And we had to, I never forget, we had to play 8 anchors. We ran out of repertoire. Finally, we left. When we arrived in Uruguay, the State Department had us spend 1 week there. Everywhere else was overnight or 2 days to repeat concert. But Uruguay arranged 6 days. And it was a great experience. The kids were asking me, why don't you live here? There are beaches, the whole Montevideo, as you know it, is surrounded by beaches all across. And as you go to Punta del Este, the famous resort, beaches all across the coast. Why? I said, well, my life has evolved to music in the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, United States, so it's too far away in those days, long flight. But they loved it, which was great. We didn't only play Montevideo, but the State Department had us play in several cities. One of the great experiences, as a parenthesis to what you asked me, was an interesting one. The person that received me from the embassy, American embassy, and escorted me when we traveled throughout the country to the concerts was someone called John Graves. John Graves, not long before, was the main person of the Iran hostages, around 50 hostages, and he was a spokesperson for them. There was a ticket tape parade when they came back to America, when they were finally freed. I think President Carter arranged, after he left office, freedom for the hostages. They had the ticket tape parade, and he was the one speaking for them. Then shortly after, the State Department sent him to Uruguay. As he had a special title, but one of his duties was to help me get around the country. So the orchestra went in this luxurious bus. I went on a limousine with John Graves. The most amazing conversations you can imagine. 2 weeks after he had the ticket tape parade in Fifth Avenue, New York. I asked him all kinds of questions, of which he answered some, others he said, I can't. But he loved music, and we became lifetime friends. I was often in their house in Montevideo for dinner. The orchestra had a great time. So the public was totally different in each city. Mexico has a great tradition for music and great composers. So does Brazil. And most of those countries, really. And even in the smaller cities, there was great expectation. At the beginning, the orchestra, Juilliard Orchestra, I was concerned because even though these were all soloist trained players, the violins, the cellos, all went to Juilliard hoping and trying to, and many of them could become, and some have become soloists, but orchestral technique of following each other and blending in and repertoire was unknown to most of them, in spite of playing once a week in an orchestra Juilliard. So at the beginning, I was concerned. By the time we got to Buenos Aires, after about 12 concerts, they were sounding, to me at those days, like the best orchestra in the world. They really blended together. And there was such a success in Buenos Aires that the critics, and there were many critics in those days, came backstage to see for themselves if these were really young kids. And they said, yeah, they look 18, 20. How's that possible? They thought these are mature players. So the public was great everywhere. Teatro Colón, where we played in Buenos Aires, has a very special public, very warm public. So it's amazing. You can't leave the stage I remember in Buenos Aires especially, we left the stage after about 20 minutes of applause, back to the hotel to change. We were called, come back, the public won't leave. That was an incredible, players, whenever I encounter these days, they said, do you remember Buenos Aires? We had to get dressed quickly and get back to the stage, you know, not with tails anymore or whatever that happened. And we just took a bow, we didn't play anymore. But very warm, they love it when orchestras come from abroad, and orchestras love to go there. I made many tours of South America over many years. I remember a tour with the National Chamber Orchestra of France from Toulouse, National Toulouse Chamber Orchestra, also organized by Grappa. I think he organized all or most of my tours of America. And that was a great tour also. Then I went to the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. Now that's another story, that's an amazing one. May I take one moment to tell you about that?
Of course.
So the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, that came about because the ambassador of Uruguay in London did a reception dinner for Princess Anne, the Queen's daughter. And the morning of I was invited, and the morning of the dinner, I called them. I must have had an intuition to ask, where am I sitting? Because there were about 75 guests. They said immediately, you're sitting to the right of Princess Anne, in the main table. So I became a bit nervous. And I called a friend, a music critic, actually, who worked closely, Denby Richards, an amazing personality in England. I asked him, how do I greet her? Do I shake hands? And his reply was, no, you don't touch any part of her. He said, royalty, you don't touch them. So that was amazing. But I looked her up. I found out her charities, some unusual charities, not the usual charities. And then I felt comfortable. She was delightful, made me feel at home immediately. And she had also looked me up and knew all about me, which was wonderful. So after the dinner, head of the foreign service, I guess, came to me and said, you had a very lovely conversation with Ziemann. I said, yes, she's delightful. Would you like to make a tour of South America with an orchestra, not a big orchestra, but a small orchestra of your choice? So that's how it happened. It wasn't sponsored, as usually those tours are, by the British Consul, but by the foreign service. Mm-hmm. So I chose the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. I was working with them, making many records at the time. So it was a perfect vehicle. We had a fantastic tour all over South America, sponsored by them. My latest tour, South America, was with the Russian National Orchestra. Russian National Orchestra has a misleading name, because you will think that it's a government-sponsored orchestra. In fact, it's probably the only really private orchestra, in fact, sponsored by American donors. Mm-hmm. American donors pay for it. The pianist Plotkin organized it many years ago, and they asked me to make a tour with them, South America, which they loved. It was a fantastic tour. They're one of the great orchestras. But your original question, how would the audiences differ from one city to another, is more like what unites them: great enthusiasm for music, for classical music, everywhere, from Mexico all the way down to the small cities in Argentina, Chile, Peru, and they have evolved. The orchestra in Montevideo, there are two orchestras now. They are the same players. This is unique also. Uruguay is unique in many ways. One of the ways in which it's unique is there are two symphony orchestras. They are mostly the same players. Mm-hmm. It's just incredible. It's not quite the same as it used to be. Because of that, perhaps they're overworked. One of the best orchestras in South America at the moment is in Lima, Peru.
Really?
It's incredible, because at the time that Sergio Celibidache became the conductor there during the war, can you imagine, from being the music director of the Berlin Philharmonic, he had to leave. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the war. He landed in Peru, and the orchestra, I conducted them not too many years later. It was in very, very poor shape, which made Celibidache's gestures very big. I saw him making his American debut, incredibly, what he was already an elderly gentleman, conducting the Curtis Institute Orchestra. They invited him to make his debut. Mm-hmm. I went to Carnegie Hall because I studied at Curtis. I was very curious, especially curious to see Celibidache work. And I saw his gestures, enormous. I imagine that was a result of those years conducting in Peru in those days to get them to play together. Today, the orchestra is really amazing for South America, second only perhaps to the two major Buenos Aires orchestras. But not even that is one of the top ones. And as a result, the public has evolved as well. Peru is rather doing well financially, I guess, because they managed to bring orchestras just to Lima. Last year, or before the pandemic, I think 2 years ago, they brought the London Symphony with Simon Rattle for 2 concerts, all the way from London to Lima for 2 concerts. Mm-hmm. That's very, very expensive, and Peru was able to do it. Mexico does that. I went to Mexico also 2 years ago with the English Chamber Orchestra for 4 concerts.
Peru is interesting to me for many, many reasons. As I said to you, I've never been there, but it's very high on my list of countries in the world, not just South America, that I'd like to go to. I travel, as you do, a lot for work, and I like to stay in hotels that have very good radio selections. And I'm not doing advertising here, but there's a hotel in Dublin called the Dillon Hotel. It's not quite as central. The beds are way too low. There are things that are a little too trendy. The breakfast is delicious, but it has the best radio selection of any hotel I've been to in the world. And it was in the Dillon Hotel in Dublin that I discovered the Peruvian National Music Network. And the quality of that radio programming of classical music is extraordinary. It's world class. It's like what we hear in Austria and Germany and France and WQXR in New York City and certain places in the world where a radio station is also a cultural institution. And I receive mail and messages from listeners of mine around the world. I get more communications from Peru than I do from Italy. And that's Italy amazing. Is my other nation where I live part of the time. And the Peruvians clearly have this passion for classical music that has struck me, because no radio station could be that good and not be so influential. And yes.
No, I just want to say that every year when I go to conduct in Peru, I go to Peru for 2 weeks a year or something. And the radio station interviews me. And last year or the year before, they gave me a list of the records of mine, the recordings that they have in the library. And I couldn't believe it. Some of the records I forgot that I made, and some which are long out of circulation. But pages and pages of my recordings, I was very impressed. I don't know how they got them, but it was quite an experience.
And another nation that very dear to me is Argentina, where I've worked a lot. Argentina. Listeners know I worked at the Metropolitan Opera in the 1980s. And when I left the Met, I left primarily because I missed travel and being on the road. And I loved the Met. But I wanted to be out in the world and in theaters again. And my first invitation to work was at the Teatro Colón, and I had never been to Argentina by then. This was 1988. It was a production of Electra, and I was interested, number one, to go to Argentina for many reasons, but number two, to work on a production of an opera that did not strike me as being central to the repertory. Now, I learned a lot more in Argentina, because there's a large German presence, there's a large Jewish presence in Argentina, and audiences are very sophisticated. What is also remarkable in the Teatro Colón, among many, many things, is the acoustic is just extraordinary. Extraordinary. The theater opened, I know this just in my head without research, May 25th, 1908. Oh. And the people of the city are intensely proud. It's on the Avenida 7 Julio, in the main street of Buenos Aires. And it sits there the way the Opera House would in Milan or Paris or San Francisco, right in the heart of the city. The Met, I love the Met, as I've said, is on the sort of Olympic height of Lincoln Center and separated from the street,
Yes.
which is fine. The piazza of of Lincoln Center is beautiful, but the immediacy of the Teatro Colón and the awareness of all the 10 million people of Buenos Aires of what it is and what it means is remarkable. Because it's such a big boulevard, they have built a tunnel underneath the boulevard on the other side, and many of the scenic shops and the rehearsal rooms are actually not in the building, but underneath this big boulevard. And I mentioned that the scenery is made in South America, in Chile. The costumes are made in the Teatro Colón. And because if you have a nation that has so many cows and all of that meat and all of this wool from all the sheep, the costumes are beautiful leather boots and wool. And so it's amazing. And there is a section, I don't know if they still have it, in the auditorium that was set aside for widows. And they would come in black, and it's on the house left, about one tier up, and it had sort of a curtain so that they could see out, but you could not see in and see the widows. So women who were no longer part of society with their husbands could attend the opera and not be seen. And the theater has so many traditions, as much as you find in Paris and Vienna and Milan and New York. And they are justifiably proud. So what I want to ask you specifically, when you conduct in a theater where the acoustics are so legendary, how does that affect your conducting?
Oh, well, it's a great experience, always conducting at Teatro Colón. Always. It's always sold out. Tickets are amazingly inexpensive. And then when one leaves, back when you leave the performance, there's always an enormous amount of people waiting outside to greet the artists. It's a very warm public, whether it's local artists or foreign artists. It's a marvelous experience. The public is so receptive. The acoustics are great. It only affects me as conductor in that I need less rehearsal to try out the hall because I know how it's going to sound. I have to tell you about Teatro Colón in relation to your question, which is very interesting indeed. One of the performances that stays very much in my mind was not with a visiting orchestra, but with their own orchestra, because it happened to be on the night that Argentina won the World Cup. First time it was held in Buenos Aires, and they won it, finally, after years and years of trying it. So in the morning, after the rehearsal, before the game took place, soccer, football game, the concertmaster came to me and said, Maestro, I don't know what to tell you, but if we win, which I don't know if we will, we cannot possibly give a concert tonight. It will be out of the question, it will be chaos. So I said, well, it's not up to me. Let's go to the head of the theater and ask the same question. In those days, there was a military dictatorship, I guess, in Argentina. So the head of the Teatro Colón was a general. So we went up to his office, to the general, very polite, very official. So I asked the concertmaster, since it was his idea, to pose the question. General said, absolutely not. It's nothing. I hope we win, of course, I'm a patriot, but the concert has nothing to do with it. The concert will take place. Question answer. So then I went to the hotel. By 4 o'clock, when the game was starting, it was like the world had stopped. Silence in the city. You couldn't hear it. The birds stopped flying. Everything stopped. So I was in my hotel room watching the TV. Sure enough, Argentina won. Then came time for the concert. They had arranged for a driver to take me to. I said, I don't need a driver. It's only 3 blocks away. It's just, I can walk there in 7, 8 minutes. I said, no. Especially tonight, you need a driver. So the driver showed up, and he said, no way we can get there by car. I'll carry your clothes, your taxi, your tails, and your music, and we hope you make it there, because the great avenue you mentioned in front of Teatro Colón, a huge, long avenue, takes about 7 minutes to walk across one side to the other, at least. It was full with people yelling, Argentina, they're very patriotic. They find Argentina. So you never get through. So I decided, okay, I'll walk. But the crowds were pacific, were totally peaceful. But still, they pushed me away from that. I had to follow. Finally, I made it in time. Of course, I left an hour before. And in front of the theater was a concertmaster waiting there. I said, congratulations. I said, what? He had lost his voice from yelling Argentina for the last 20 minutes. So he said, Maestro, we must play the national anthem, Argentina national anthem. We must play it. We won. So well, once again, I said, they are very official about that. We must go to ask the head of the Teatro Colón. Right back, he was there in his uniform, smiling. He said, of course, as a proud citizen, I'm glad that we won, but we cannot play the national anthem that's only reserved for national holidays. This is not a national holiday. He was going by the rules. So I'm sorry, you cannot play. Concertmaster was heartbroken. So I had a brilliant idea. I said, how about if we play it for ourselves? Let's go to the rehearsal room and celebrate by playing it for ourselves. He said, great. So we went down to the basement where the rehearsals are. And I had never heard I know the Uruguayan, I know some other national anthems, but not the Argentinian. I said, how does it go? He said, it's like a Verdi opera, it's in 4/4, it lasts about 7 minutes, so just don't worry. He sang me the first line, and I said, fine. So we did it. The orchestra was very grateful that we did it, and the cleaning ladies were, you could see, they were crying emotion, after winning the World Cup. And the concert was full. Public was full. It was great. I thought that has stayed in my memory all these years.
You reminded me of an experience of mine, namely that I was working at the Aix-en-Provence Festival on July 14th of 2018, when France was in the World Cup final, and July 14th was the national day, and France won. And before that, Aix-en-Provence, I love what you said, the birds did not even fly. Everything was completely quiet. And then there was this explosion of joy. And then there was a performance that night of Prokofiev's Fiery Angel, of all things. And the city was joyous, and it was a wonderful experience. I've experienced that in Italy. I don't know if in my lifetime I'll experience that in the United States. We have to improve our soccer program here to do that. We have the potential. We have people from all over the world here. We have Africans and Europeans and South Americans and North Americans. We could do it, but I think we need better coaching. But that's for a different visit. Okay. Another question about South America, and then we're going to move north. When I worked at the Teatro Colón, the people were incredibly generous. The food in Argentina is fantastic. I got to Uruguay a few years later. The food is fantastic, and there are similarities and differences. But I will say that the beef is magnificent in both countries. But I'm a fish eater. I like meat. I do like meat. I won't say that I don't, but I'm much more a fish eater. And here you have this incredible coastline. And for basically 3 weeks, in my first 3 weeks in Buenos Aires, I was given a beautiful steak and potatoes and chimichurri and delicious helado ice cream and delicious food. But I said to my hosts, isn't it possible to have some fish? And I said, they said to me, why? And I said, well, because I like fish. They said, fish is for sick people. Oh. We only eat fish if we're sick. And I said, well, if I eat another 30 steaks in a row, I'm going to become fish. Did you grow up? Was there fish? I mean, Uruguay has a coastline. Or was it really a meat-centered cuisine?
Meat-centered cuisine, by far. I'm Italian, pasta and beef. So this is just the habit. It's 3 times a day, practically. That's how I grew up. These days, I am probably 99% fish eater. But in those days, meat was and it still is, I guess, almost as much. Beef is first quality, as we tested. It's very different from the Japanese beef, which is also great in its own. Japan, as mostly everybody knows, they feed the cows with beer to to fatten them up and so on.
Viru, as they say, yeah.
Yes. Uruguay and Argentina, the cows are free to run around and they eat grass, so there is good tasting beef. So that was the upbringing. Beef and dulce de leche. Dulce de leche is not known in this country. You know it. Actually what it is milk and sugar cooked until it becomes mass. But it's a favorite dessert in those two countries. The Brazilian version is not as good, it's different from that. There is one in Mexico as well. But the Uruguay, Argentina, dulce de leche, they have in fact a saying for years that when foreigners come to Uruguay or Argentina and decide to live there permanently, it's because they like the dulce de leche. It's a dessert. They use it to fill pies, to put ice cream, in fact. And there is a way to make it, which I once I did. Is you can take a can of condensed milk, any kind of condensed milk, and boil it for a long time with a hole in it so it doesn't explode. And when you open it, it's dulce de leche. It's quite amazing. So once, when I was music director of the American Shakespeare Festival during my Stokovsky years, when I was associate conductor of Stokovsky, I was during the summer. I took this job as music director of America in Stratford, Connecticut. It no longer exists, but it was a marvelous experience. I got to know many Shakespeare plays. And they had to have an orchestra because the union rules for a theater says, I know the play doesn't have music generally, but you have to have an orchestra of 22 musicians. So I needed a conductor, and I was the conductor. So one day, I decided to make dulce de leche during the duration of Romeo and Juliet or one of the plays. So I knew it took about 3 hours. So I turned the fire lightly on and I put a can with lots of water. When I returned, I couldn't find the can. It was all over the ceiling. Once the water ran out after about an hour or less, the can just went all over the place. Anyway, that's one formula to make dulce de leche.
Well, had you been doing the Scottish play, listeners may not know that in English it's a superstition not to say, well, I'll say it, Macbeth. You could have said, out damn spot. This is what Lady Macbeth says as she rubs her hands. Una macchia qui tutora.
Yeah.
So you remind me one more thing, and then we're going to come north above the equator. Buenos Aires, the ice cream is second best in the world. Only Italy is better. And the tradition of the gelatiere from Italy came to Argentina. Argentina is about 48% Italian origin. And one of the best ice creams in the world is in a place called Freddo, which means cold in Italian. And it's a combination of raspberry, frambuesa, and Malbec wine, or Malbec grapes, not wine, Malbec grapes. It's just extraordinary.
Freddo, yeah.
Yeah, and I would travel thousands of miles just for that, but also everything else about South America. But you came north, you came to the United States at a very young age. Were you 16, something like that? 17?
Yeah, almost 17.
Almost 17. And you quickly came under the influence, under the batons of some of the great conductors and conducting teachers. How did that happen?
Well, I was very lucky that, first of all, Bohuslav Martinu, the great Czech composer, he was really responsible. He invited me to study with him at Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. At the same time, Howard Hanson, whose music I loved at the time, invited me to study with him at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. And I had both scholarships, full scholarships, arranged by the US State Department, by the way, but they accepted me. So I had to make a very difficult decision between Martinu, whose music I didn't know at the time, although I knew he was an important composer, and Hanson, who I knew the music and I loved it. The reason I chose Philadelphia was purely because my family lived there. My whole family came from Russia, my father's family, and for now 150 years, they lived in Philadelphia. In fact, my father first came to America before emigrating to Uruguay or going to Uruguay to start the company. So I chose Curtis for that reason. By the time I arrived there, Martinu had left the United States. Oh. And I studied with Vittorio Giannini, became a great friend, a wonderful man, a wonderful teacher. and a great mentor. So that's how it happened. In order to get me into Curtis with short notice, Virgil Thompson was responsible, actually. I had met him, and he talked to Copland, Aaron Copland. Between the two of them, arranged for me to study at Tanglewood with Copland. Then Virgil Thompson was amazing, really. He went to see Ormandy, showed him some of my scores, and so Ormandy recommended me.
Being the music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Philadelphia Orchestra. Yes. Eugene Ormandy was music director. So Ormandy recommended me to Curtis because it's very hard to get into Curtis, you know. It's only, students are only allowed on scholarship. You do not pay, unlike most of schools all over the world, especially in the United States. So because it's on scholarship and because it's a very small school, in those days it only had 100 students. Now it has, I think, 160, 180, 100 students. So it's almost impossible to get in. So I got in, I think, thanks to Ormandy, Virgil Thompson, I don't know who else recommended me. So that's how that started. Then my first great mentor, I guess, became Leopold Stokovsky. There were two, in those days, two conductors were household names, as you know, Toscanini and Stokovsky. Mm-hmm. And what happened is just one of those coincidences that happen once in a lifetime, that he wanted to premiere Ives' Fourth Symphony. It was the second time he attempted to do it. And apparently they couldn't get past the first bar because the way it was written, it wasn't meant the way I gather to this day, that he just wrote it as he felt it. He wrote once Ives. It wasn't his fault the musicians only had 10 fingers. So, or that they needed to breathe from time to, so he wrote, while answering the phone and so on. Fantastic music, but very hard to play. So they couldn't get through. And Stokowski announced the premiere in Houston. He was then the conductor of the Houston Symphony in Texas. And he announced the world premiere of Ives' Fourth and invited, in typical Stokowski fashion, invited Time Magazine, Newsweek, Life Magazine was still alive in those days, Associated Press, United Press, and New York Times, and so on and so forth. And he was stuck. They couldn't play it. He didn't know what to do. A musician in the orchestra, on his first day at work, a cellist, showed him the score of my first symphony, which he took it, and I let him take it. He said, looked at it, and the way I heard it is, turn the pages, great, we'll premiere this instead. That's how it happened. So we met, and then I have to tell you a quick anecdote. I only had a conversation with Stokovsky for about 30 seconds. I asked him, I would really like to be a conductor as much as composer. Do you have any advice for me backstage before the performance? He said, yes, of course. Go around the world and watch all the bad conductors and learn what not to do. Mm. It was very puzzling to me at the time. It's true that one can learn from other people's mistakes, to avoid making the same mistake. But one also learns from people's experience. I learned a great deal about watching Stokowski himself, but that was the only time we spoke. Then a few years later, I think it must have been 3 or 4 years later, 3 years later, I read that he had organized his orchestra in New York, the American Symphony Orchestra. And I remember I was in Mexico conducting, and I went to Acapulco for 3 or 4 days vacation, holiday. So I sent him a telegram. There were telegrams. This is long before the internet. I said, Maestro, can I help in any way or something like that? Or can I give any service? Within minutes, I got a telegram back saying, yes, you will be my associate conductor. Amazing, he never saw me conduct. If you don't mind auditioning the players. 150 or so of them. Mm-hmm. So that was my first really important job, like at Carnegie Hall and so on. So that's how I met Stokowski. Before that, I guess it was Dorati. After 2 years at Curtis, I decided to graduate right away because Philadelphia, I found it, I was only studying composition in those days there, and of course piano and violin and so on, but I wanted to study conducting. I went to see Efrem Zimbalist, the legendary violinist who was the head of Curtis Institute. And I said,
and father of the actor Efrem Zimbalist.
Yes, a famous actor. Indeed. Efrem Zimbalist was the old hour tradition. and I went to see him, although we saw each other at lessons every day. I would really like to study conducting. Why don't you have a conducting school? We don't. The last one was Fritz Reiner here, he told me, who taught Bernstein. Bernstein graduated from Curtis as a conducting student of Fritz Reiner. We no longer teach conducting because conducting, he said, cannot be taught. Either you are or you're not. He mentioned Toscanini, as you did a little while back. He said he didn't study conducting. He didn't like the conductor, stood up in the podium and conducted from memory, and the career went on. He said, all the great conductors of today, he mentioned Pierre Monteux, Toscanini, Stokovsky, they never studied conducting, they became conductors, so we don't teach conducting. So I wasn't happy with that answer, and I wrote to the State Department because I had a scholarship, very unusual, like a Fulbright in reverse, which didn't exist, but they arranged it. I had that. I wrote saying, I need conducting classes. So they said, fine, we'll write to Mr. Ormandy, see if he's willing or able or interested. We will pay him. Ormandy immediately arranged for his assistant conductor, Bill Smith. In these days, people change jobs every few weeks. Bill Smith was the assistant conductor his whole life. The title never became associate or he was the assistant and pianist, terrific pianist. He became my teacher. I learned a great deal from him in those 2 years. Basics, which I didn't have, even though I had done hundreds of concerts with the youth orchestra, but I learned a great deal from Bill Smith. He was a great musician. That was it. Then I decided to graduate because it was no real conducting. I couldn't have an orchestra to try out. So I asked Cymbalist, I went back to see him, can I graduate sooner than the 4 years? He said, sure. Bernstein graduated in 2 years. You can also, if you fulfill the requirements for composition, your main subject composition, you have to have a piano sonata, string quartet, whatever it was. So I did it, and I graduated in 2 years. Then I didn't know what would happen next. So I realized Mr. Dorati had a Dorati Fellowship in Minneapolis. He was a conductor. Until Dorati was a conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra. In those days, it was called Minneapolis Symphony. And I sent him a telegram. He said, great, meet me tomorrow in New York at Great Northern Hotel. I don't know if it still exists, across from Carnegie Hall.
Yeah. No.
No? So meet me at Great Northern, 8 in the morning, and bring the symphony, something, to conduct from memory. So I took a train. In those days, it took 4 hours. Now it takes less than 2. I had to get up middle of the night. I arrived in New York at 7 in the morning. I went across the street from the hotel to the Horn and Hardart, I don't know if you remember, across the street from right next to Carnegie Hall to have a coffee.
For listeners who don't know Horn and Hardart, you would put a nickel in a door and you'd open the door and take out a sandwich or a piece of pie or a cup of coffee.
Exactly. It was amazing. So at 8 in the morning, I went across the street and I found out his room and I knocked at the door. Dorati received me in his dressing gown and said, good, you're just in time. Please conduct, what are you going to conduct for me? I said, where is the orchestra? No, this is a hotel room. There is no orchestra here. If you can show me with your gestures, you can let me feel the music, you have what it takes. So what are you going to conduct? I said, well, Schubert Unfinished, first movement. Perfect. I said, great. Then he left the room. He went to the bathroom to shave. He said, don't worry, I can see you from the mirror while shaving. So I was, I must have been 19 by then. So I began to conduct Schubert Unfinished with many interruptions. His daughter, Tonina, was 18, showed up and didn't understand what was going on. Then his wife, his mother-in-law, the maid with the breakfast, which she dropped. So anyway, he came back, drying his face, smiling and laughing, and said, great, you have it. You in the middle of all the pandemonium, you kept on conducting, tempo, and I heard the music. Seeing you conduct, I felt the music. If you hadn't told me it was Schubert Unfinished, I would have said that's Schubert Unfinished. So I relieved, and I left. Then another conductor wanted the job, was my friend, a great friend, a great conductor, David Ziemann. David was next. He never got to audition. When David arrived, Dorati told me, and David told me later, he said, sorry, we already made the choice. He never. But David went to Minneapolis anyway, like me. He had just graduated from Oberlin. And it was too late in the season, I guess, to make. So he was there even to more rehearsals than I was. And so that's how I met Durati. That was my first real teacher. It was a fantastic experience. Montevideo was another conducting teacher. He had a school of conductors. This is amazing. About 90 to 100 young conductors played in the orchestra. You had to be an orchestra player.
It was in Maine, is that
yes,
correct?
Hancock, Maine. Hancock.
Yeah.
It was an incredible experience. So you sat among 80 plus 90 conductors, all ages 18 to 24. There was a limit of age. And you conducted for a long time, 20 minutes to half an hour, while he sat in the viola section. He was a violist and made fun of us. That's how we learned. So that was but I learned really much from watching rehearsals. This is what many young conductors today don't have that opportunity. There is not enough time or not enough tradition. I watched 2 years of rehearsals of Durati. He had a fantastic rehearsal technique. I watched Stokovsky for 5 years rehearsing the American Symphony. His rehearsals were like a general going to war. Everything was planned. And then my equally great or even greater experience was 2 years with Zell, George Zell. I was composer in residence of the Cleveland Orchestra. But we sat for 2 years until he died, watching him rehearse. And that was it. So rehearsal technique is one of the most important elements for a conductor.
Whenever I talk to conductors, and you are another example of this, they in their discussion raise about 20 topics that I could go down any one of the 20 roads. Actually, in preparation for our discussion, I wrote down about 15 of them anyway, so I'm glad we're in the same place. I try to decide where to start, but I think it's important to start with something you said, namely that conducting cannot be taught. And I have a feeling you disagree with that. And that conducting can be taught. And it's not just about attending rehearsals, but knowing what to look for. But very specifically, Pierre Monteux was famous for his, what I'm going to ask you to explain, baton technique. Toscanini said that Monteux had the best baton technique of anyone. What does that mean?
It means if you're going to use a baton as against the hands, like Stokovsky used, or other conductors, then the baton is simply an extension of the arm. And if some conductors will use a baton, many conductors do, not the great ones, have the baton pointing up. It's ridiculous, because what the musicians look for is the tip of the baton. Yeah. And if the conductor uses the whole arm, that's also confusing. So it has to be the wrist. So the baton, if it's considered as an extension of the arm, then that's what it is. And the reason for the baton is simple, that players in the back, way up there, the trombones and percussion and so on, cannot see as much, they are far away. So having the baton, in opera, I always use a baton, because again, makes it easier for the singers to see from far away while singing the beat when they have to. So baton technique is being able to anticipate. This is very hard. It takes time, it takes experience, it takes great teachers. Anticipate the music a millisecond. If you are with the music, it's too late. It's just before. And that takes time to learn. Then baton technique means knowing the tempo, the speed one is going to take a piece before it starts. So the first, when you lift the arm to give the speed, they already know how fast it's going to go. If you go like this, they know it's going to be fast. If you go like this, baton techniques meaning more difficult with a baton, excuse me, than with the hands, is the expression of the music. If it's short notes, staccato we call it, then you need a sharp, right? If it's legato, you need that, and that shows them the. So baton technique means inspiring the players. One of the conductors, amazingly, that has the best. Well, Laurie Mazel was famous for his baton technique.
Yes.
Amazing baton, he could do anything. But Zubin Mehta has an amazing baton technique as well, also because he shows the music, the character of the music with his facial expressions. So it's not only baton technique, but showing what it should sound like. But now the opposite extreme. There are some conductors, I hate to say this, sounds terrible, especially Hungarian conductors. It's just coincidence that have the most strange baton technique, and they get incredible results, with the great exception of Fritz Reiner, who had the most amazing baton technique. But even my teacher, Antal Dorati, see, he was left-handed. Dorati was extremely left-handed.
Yeah.
But he knew at the beginning when he conducted ballet, orchestras were confused when he used to conduct with the left hand. They just couldn't follow. So he taught himself to be right hand. So he became ambidextrous. He showed me several times he could sign his name with both hands at the same time. Incredible. So he conducted with the right hand to make it easier. But it looked like a left hand because it was his left hand. Scholti, all over the place, but the music making was fabulous, was extraordinary. So there are no rules really. Baton technique. I guess you could put it in one line, is the technique to get the best results. Now, when they teach conducting in schools, it's very elementary regarding technique. They teach how to beat 3, how to beat 4, 6, 8, which is very difficult to beat. Juilliard has one of the most demanding entrance requirements to study conducting. They play at the piano several chords, and you have to write it down. That's very important. You have to show that you have a good ear. Although a great ear is not essential. I work with some great conductors that didn't have perfect pitch. Perfect pitch means, of course, being able to recognize notes. If you play 4 notes, you have to say A, B, D, F, whatever. I know many important conductors that didn't have that, but Juilliard requires that in order to study conducting. And you have to read a piano score, you have to read they put a score, and you have to read at the piano. Some great conductors never played piano. Toscanini is a great cellist, apparently. So regarding technique, now conductors that do not use baton, Stokovsky being the prime example, he had the best baton technique of anyone in the world. You could never miss his beat. It was amazing. And it also looked beautiful, beautiful gestures, studied gestures, but it was so clear. The one, hitting like a table, you could see the one, no matter how soft or loud it was. Marvelous technique. And he was, of course, self-taught. One of my conducting teachers that I didn't mention before was Eleazar de Carvalho, Brazilian conductor, at Tanglewood, 2 summers in a row. He was all about technique. He only spoke, his students were Seiji Ozawa, who was my roommate at Tanglewood. They put us both in the same room because we were both foreigners. So Seiji, Zubin Mehta, Claudio Abado, and countless others studied with Eleazar. And for some reason, they seldom mention him in their bios. But Eleazar de Carvalho only spoke about technique, and he carried it to extremes. He said, this is the way you should walk on stage. And, no, not this way, walk this way. And he had always thinking of the public, which I didn't agree. He will tell me something like conducting Mussorgsky, Night on Bald Mountain. There is a passage at the end. He said to me, pick up the sound from the violins. Just hold it. Make sure the public sees you holding it and give it to the flutes. That's theater. Mm-hmm. And I never think of that. But he was one of the 2 main proteges of Serge Kusevitsky, as you know, in Boston. The other one was Leonard Bernstein. And Carvalho was a wonderful, wonderful teacher for all of us of technique.
I was going to talk to you about a particular Hungarian conductor for a reason. You named him George Schulte, because the next topic I wanted to get to, the baton is in the right hand. Every conductor I have ever observed has his or her own usage of the left hand. And I could never compare one conductor to another in that regard. And I had the honor once of speaking to Maestro Schulte, And I asked him about his left hand because to me, his was the great left hand of all. And he said it's the left hand of God.
Oh my, sounds like Maradona.
I know, which is a soccer statement, but but it was a very beautiful thing to watch. And I remember I was once at a rehearsal, in Chicago for Otello that he was conducting. And it's as if he was staging the whole opera, not as a stage director, but as a music director with the left hand. And he's so intimately somehow channeled from the score into his hand. He didn't act out the music, but he perfectly communicated to his musicians and to the singers, Pavarotti, Kiritakanawa, what he wanted. And since then, I've watched every other conductor's left hand. Valery Gergiev, who often does not use a baton in the right hand, unlike Schulte, who did.
A pencil sometimes.
Yes. He also, with both hands, does things. And would you talk to me? I don't know if you've ever thought about your left hand as a conductor, but what happens for you when you're conducting and using that left hand?
A very interesting question. Absolutely. I tell my students, a few students I have from time to time, to put at the beginning the left hand in their pocket, not to use the left hand. Because the tendency of every beginner conductor, and some already not so beginning, is to use like a mirror. And that's the worst thing. If an orchestra sees a conductor doing this, both hands, you lost them. Forget it. They know this is not a real professional. So the first thing is to, of course, put the hand in the pocket and then learning independence. Then the second lesson is try to beat time at different speeds and use the left hand to make a crescendo, to get louder and louder and louder, bigger, and then diminuendo, and then a different speed and different meter, and then different things to gain independence of the hands. Now that can be carried to an extreme, like Boulez. Boulez was one of the conductors, like Stokovsky, who never used the baton. He had a very different technique, very clear technique, but not didn't use the baton. I thought he could have used the baton, especially when he conducted at Bayreuth. He did operas, the Ring, and many things. Even though he's below and they can see him, but other times, in opera, the singers need to see it clearly. Anyway, he had a very clear beat without the baton. But his left hand didn't do much at all. Left hand for me is crucial. For me, left hand is showing the character and cueing sometimes, turning pages when I use a score, practical things, but also expression. Especially if you're using a baton, it's only so much a baton can do to show expression. Left hand can show. You can ask for more sound. I cannot ask for more sound with the right hand. I can make bigger gesture, it doesn't help. So left hand can show more sound. You can sometimes, often the brass, I go like this, meaning too much, less. So I use left hand for extra purposes. Now with great orchestras, really great orchestras, like Schulte conducted and other people, you can take, and Gergiev, you can take more liberties and you don't need to beat time all the time. Just to start the tempo and then you can lead, give expression, make music without necessarily beating 3/4 or 4/4 and so on.
A number of years ago, I had the wonderful, for me, educational opportunity to go on a short tour with Valery Gergiev and the Mariinsky Orchestra in the United States to 4 cities, beginning in Chicago and then Cleveland and actually Toronto, so not the United States, and then New York. And they played the same program in all 4 cities. But what Gergiev did, and Gergiev is someone who often gets to the podium quite late. He's very spontaneous. He's very impulsive, fascinating for all of that reason. And what he explained to me was he knew, and his musicians knew, what they wanted to do sound-wise. And it was his responsibility in each theater that he went to, and they were on a tour, to seat the musicians in each theater to get the sound that he wanted. So that Toronto, this was the older hall in Toronto, had, I think the O'Keefe Center is called, had not the best acoustic, but he knew what he wanted, and therefore they were doing Stravinsky, seated the musicians very differently from the way they were seated in Chicago or New York. And I've never met another conductor who quite does that. Now, obviously, being on tour is different from working, let's say, in New York at what used to be called Avery Fisher Hall and is now David Geffen Hall, say with the New York Philharmonic, and you do 3 or 4 performances of the same program. Here, Gergiev did 1 performance of the same program on a tour. When I've spoken with other conductors, no one has ever mentioned doing that. I asked you before about the Teatro Cologne in preparation for this question. To what degree, when you're working with a musical ensemble, do you factor in the hall for the program, or is that not an issue?
Very much an issue, very much. You know, one of the secrets, Stokowski developed this incredible, amazing Philadelphia orchestra sound to this day is known. And it was partly in his mind, and he intended partly the fact that most of the players all came from the same school, the Curtis Institute of Music, so they had same technique and so on. But the great part of the time was planned. He experimented with that, what you're saying, all the time in the same hall in Philadelphia, which they no longer use. And because the hall had problems, even though it's an old hall, most old halls are very good with acoustics, but the Philadelphia hall was not very good for him. So he decided not to use risers for the brass. The orchestra played, and he loved conducting in London, but he very much resented the Royal Festival Hall, which is a great hall, but it has built-in risers for the brass, huge risers. So he found it, and I find it, very hard to balance the orchestra because the brass overwhelms, the sound goes way across everybody. And the only reason for those risers was so the public could see them. There was no other reason but to hide. So he kept, and Philadelphia Orchestra has more or less kept, he kept all the way to the Normandy years because they kept the same tradition. Other things that Stokowski did no matter where he conducted was to change the seating of the orchestra, as you just said with Gergiev, from hall to hall. So no matter where he conducted, you always had the winds to his right, where they normally, or around the world, sit either the cellos, or in Germany and Austria, the violas. He had the winds. So the reason he gave me when I asked him why, he said, well, that way they don't have to fight for sound with the strings, with the 60 strings in front of them. And also, he said, so the public can see them, since there are no risers. But I said, that all makes sense. However, now they are not facing the audience. They are sideways. The sound goes this way. He said, well, tell me, please go into the hall, Carnegie Hall, and tell me if you can hear it. It's fantastic. For the first time, you can hear the winds like you do in a recording, where the mic is close enough that they come much more than a regular performance. He was constantly changing the seating. One time he had the basses in back of the orchestra, double basses, standing on a big platform. The basses was in a platform. You suddenly heard this bass sound like an organ. He was an organist, and he remembered that sound. And then he had the French horns right in front. So the sound coming out of the bell will bounce on the double basses. So for a while, I was trying not to be influenced by Stokowski. So I used the baton, especially in front of him, so he could see, look, I'm myself, I don't follow you. But I did follow him a few tours that I made, changing the seating of the orchestra. And usually orchestras didn't mind, but the management resented it. You know, they've been playing for 50 years this way, and now they put them this way. But I was influenced by that, trying to find better sound. Now I don't do that, except when possible, I ask to remove risers, not to use risers for the brass. And it makes an enormous difference, because then I don't have to go like this, the brass, and the balance is better. Part of the problem is all composers until beginning of the last century, all composers, and that includes Brahms, Tchaikovsky, everybody in those days, even early Sibelius, wrote the same dynamic marking for all the instruments. rounds there too. So if it was a loud passage, let's say, they write forte for everybody, or fortissimo, or 3Fs for the whole orchestra. Now, fortissimo in flute is not like a tuba or a trombone. It requires coming down. So when I do conductor's pieces, I prepare the parts and I mark it down from 2Fs to mezzo forte, half as loud, and so on. But mostly I ask for the brass, everybody to be on the same level, percussion as well, as a way that I don't have to do that. It naturally fixes itself. But when you tour, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay, so when you tour with orchestras, one of the problems is how not to become stale. 4 concerts, it's all right, 4 cities. But when you do like my first Juilliard tour, 19 concerts, how we had 2 programs and still, so that by the 4th it doesn't become memory. So I invented this trick for myself. I discovered to slightly change the tempo each time. Mm-hmm. And I never had to explain. They're such intelligent players. Never had to say, look, don't worry, I will make it faster. They got the idea right away. He kept it fresh. Not enough to make a difference in the interpretation, but enough just so it's a new performance, a new beginning, not the same thing all over again.
What I was going to ask you was, we who work in music in different ways, for the opera world, which is my main part of the music world that I work in, I coined a term planet opera. In other words, we who work in it or go to it all live on this particular planet, but we don't always see one another. We may know of one another. And there's a similar world I know in symphonic music and chamber music, and there is some overlap among all the music people. And this leads to my asking whether you ever encountered a particular person whose name was Richard Horowitz, no relation to Vladimir Horowitz. And I knew him as Dick Horowitz. Dick had the longest career of any musician in the history of the Metropolitan Opera. He was with the Met for 66 years. He was a timpanist and began at a time when there were not that many recordings, so that he learned his music from the scores. Most musicians I know now go to listen to recordings by other musicians.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Or singers. Dick learned everything from the score, and because he went back to 1946, he graduated from Juilliard as a very young man and went right to the Met, practically right to the Met. And he came to know all the conductors, especially because he was sort of the oracle, the authority on what so-and-so might have conducted in 1948 and how this musician would approach this or that. Dick also took photographs from the orchestra pit of the old Met and the new Met of curtain calls of singers. And his wife, who I know was 99, has this archive of photos that I would like to help her get to the right place. But I mentioned Dick for a particular reason. Conductors loved him, relied on him. And at a certain point, he began a second career in addition to being a great musician.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yes.
He made all my batons.
That's why I wanted to, that's what I wanted to ask you. He became the baton maker of choice for conductors. And Leonard Bernstein, who I was fortunate to know and work with a lot, when Lenny died, he was buried with 2 things. He was buried with the score, the Mahler Fifth Symphony, and a Dick Horowitz baton.
I didn't know that.
And every single conductor he worked with, Dick knew their hands, knew how they wanted to hold the baton. And what I'm going to ask, since we've come up with the subject of Dick, I'm going to ask Johann, my engineer in Berlin, to focus on Maestro, and I'm going to go reach for my Dick Horowitz baton. So please talk about Dick, and I'm going to reach for the baton.
Fantastic. So I loved him, of course. He was amazing. He made all my batons for many, many years. And what he did was he will do like a tailor. You know, he will give me Monteur's baton, Zell's baton, everybody, including Lenny Bernstein's baton. and said, try it out, see how it feels. Is it too long? Is it too short? Is it too heavy? Whatever. And then according to my replies and my comments, my feelings, he will then tell me, this is you. And then he will send me the first baton. And then the next year he said, let's try the same test all over again, because your technique may have evolved. You may use now larger gestures or smaller gestures. So please try your baton, the one I made for you last year, and let me know if it still works. And I traveled with his batons all over the world. It was fantastic. There was another baton maker like that that also did it as a favor. You know, he never think of charging us, even though we all offered. The librarian of the Pittsburgh Symphony. Well, he liked the conductor. He offered to make us batons. So again, every Christmas, I will receive from him an envelope well secured with 3 or 4 or 5 batons. Again, he did it with it like a tailor. He asked me, try this one, try that one. And then depending on our replies, he will make a baton. I don't know how they did it. And there is your baton. Made by
Yes,
Horowitz.
so if Johann could go back to me, I'd like to show the audience's baton. This, Dick had a wonderful hand, and he wrote in tiny print on here that he made it on November, or he finished it on November 24th, 2012. And he wrote a Leonard Bernstein baton. I don't know if that's visible at all, but what Lenny liked particularly was this part. What would you call that, Maestro?
I don't think we have a name for it.
Okay.
The base.
That it be made,
the base. Yeah,
the base. That it be made from champagne corks.
Of course he liked that. He liked to smell it too, probably.
This was one of the last, maybe the last baton that Dick ever made. He died soon thereafter. And this is a genuine Leonard Bernstein baton. He made it for my mother, had a major birthday. And this was, he asked me, what can I give your mother that she wouldn't have? And I said, well, because my mother knew Leonard Bernstein as well, a Leonard Bernstein baton. So I've not taken this out for many, many years, but you prompted that remembrance, and I thank you for that. So,
amazing story.
It raises another thought that came to my mind, because as I said to you, conductors inspire all kinds of thinking in me. You were talking about the people who you worked with early on. You were talking about Princess Anne. You were talking about managers and other people. What I think a lot of people don't realize about the arts, the classical arts, and maybe especially the music world, is the degree to which so many things may happen in hotel rooms while conductors are shaving, or over dinner, where suddenly the idea of a tour happens. I once, long story short, the Met has a policy of not admitting latecomers, no matter who they are. And I kept out some very famous people who arrived late. And one of them was Indira Gandhi, who was a very formidable figure. And I had to say to her, Madam President, you run the largest democracy in the world, and the Metropolitan Opera is my little democracy, and the laws here apply to everyone, and I don't make exceptions. And she was not happy with that, but she understood it. And we sat down for tea and began to talk about arts in India, and Zubin Mehta, of course, but not only. And I said to her, we would love to see an Indian Arts Festival at Lincoln Center. How do I do that? And I gave her the name of a couple of people to contact. And a couple of years later, there was an Indian Arts Festival in the United States, which only happened, I think, because she was late for La Boheme one night. Oh. But it is, I think that it's a very important thing to point out how, I don't want to call it connections or recommendations, because that's sort of an old term, but feeling part of a heritage. So you're not a name dropper, but when you say to me that you worked with Vittorio Giannini, whose sister Duzzolina was a very famous singer. She was quite the personality. And Philadelphia, the Giannini family were very important to music in Philadelphia. Or when you say about the Philadelphia sound, I wanted to add that there was one more aspect to that, is that the Wanamaker's, I think was the name of the department store in Philadelphia, made a donation of 65 instruments that belonged to the orchestra but were paid for by Wanamaker's. Part of the Philadelphia sound is, in fact, these instruments that are passed on from one musician to the next when he or she arrives or leaves the orchestra. But Pierre Monteux, Carvalho, I didn't know that he worked with Claudio Botto, who was one of my major influences. It's a small world, but we're all linked to the past, and we pass on the past. So Monteux, I forget the name of the person, studied with someone who knew Hector Berlioz, which is remarkable to think about.
Never knew that.
And Monteux knew Debussy.
Yeah.
And Ravel and
Sure.
those, Stravinsky, of course.
Stravinsky, of course.
But he conducted the premiere of The Rite of Spring at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris. And I would love the way there's, an Ancestry.com. I would love to do a musical version of Ancestry.com and show the bloodlines and the influential lines.
Great idea.
For example, I knew a singer, a young singer, who studied with Maestro Ricci, who studied with Puccini. I studied with people who taught Pavarotti and Renata Tebaldi. And so therefore, it's, we in the food world, we say you are not just what you eat, but it's what the cow ate. Or the fish ate, or whatever. And similarly, we are not just who taught us, but who taught them.
That's right.
And it's quite a very long legacy. And
a great idea. I hope you do it.
Well, it'll take a lot of time. But I want to ask you about one person, because I knew him slightly, but I've never really spoken to anyone about Aaron Copland, who is considered the dean of American music. He was a gay, left-wing Jewish man from Brooklyn, but wrote music that sounds like the Wild West. It's the Lincoln Portrait, Fanfare for the Common Man. When we think of music that defines Americanness, whatever that is, it's frankly not Leonard Bernstein, it's not Charles Ives, it's Aaron Copland, I think.
Yeah.
And what was he like?
Well, I knew him, he was great to me to have accepted me as a student when I was, not yet 17 at Tanglewood, and I didn't even speak English. I didn't learn that much the first year because I missed not knowing the language well enough yet. I missed some of what he was saying. But we had first a class as a group. There were 4 students, including Rautavaara, who became my lifelong friend.
Anuhani Rautavaara, the great Finnish composer.
Yeah, since then on, he invited me to conduct in Finland. I have a long career in Finland, thanks to him from the beginning. So those classes I attended, and then there were once or twice a week private lessons for an hour. And he mostly discussed with me orchestration. And he was great on orchestration. And once he even gave the title to one of my pieces. He said, "What's the title?" I said, "It doesn't have a title yet. I'll tell you the title." He gave a piece for trumpet and strings, very short, about 5 minutes. The trumpet is off stage and only plays one note from time to time. And I said, "What would you call it?" He says, "To me, sounds like a psychological moment. It's the moment in life," he said, I'm quoting him, "where you have to make a decision to make a left or a right turn, and that decision will mark the rest of your life." Wow, that's all right, I'll call it that. So I call it in Spanish. I was still putting the titles in Spanish in those days. Momento psicológico, psychological moment. So anyway, he was great, very encouraging. We didn't get to know each other enough because my English was limited. The next year, I already spoke and heard much more, so it was better. But he was very humble, very friendly, always smiling, and very encouraging, the most important part, very encouraging. So that was my experience with Aaron Copland.
What among the things I find fascinating about him is that in the he was born in 1900 and he died in 1990. And he was in Paris in the 20s and studied with Nadia Boulanger, as many people did. In the 1930s, when America, it was the economic depression, he was very frugal. He did not part with his money easily because,
Oh,
and he lived in a very modest way compared to many people of his stature who were offered a lot of money and could have lived more extravagantly, but he really didn't. And he formed a collective of artists, namely not just musicians, but painters, photographers. He was especially interested in photography, writers, and they were sort of like a collective in a way in New York City and then elsewhere, where they influenced one another, so that he came to know choreographers and would write music when he was inspired by the choreographers. Or Stieglitz, the photographer, was a great inspiration on him in
yeah.
terms of imagery. And Aaron Copland drew from Stieglitz's and George O'Keeffe's imagery of the American West to create some of his music, such as Rodeo, Appalachian Spring. He had a personal and perhaps romantic relationship, I don't know, with someone in Mexico, and therefore was very influenced by Mexican music, wrote Salón Mexico. And I'm always impressed with Copland, the degree to which he was open to all of the arts and used them to influence him. Wagner did that to some degree. I don't think that many of our great composers were as connected to the other arts the way Aaron Copland was.
You know, I
And,
didn't know that about Copland. It's amazing. That's interesting.
and there was a playwright, Clifford Odets, who was very political, wrote wonderful plays, and Copland admired Odets, who would write incidental music. Copland wrote film scores. We think of Prokofiev, we think of Shostakovich for film scores, and Korngold, of course. But Copland won an Academy Award in 1950. Leonard Bernstein later wrote film scores. But I think because, wonderful though he was quite modest and humble and kind, as you said, that he doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. I don't think that there are people around nowadays to really advocate for him unless they come to know his biography and admire his music. But he was hugely influential in American music.
He was the, so as you say, the dean of American music. It still is. It's interesting to me also that Copland, Gershwin, Bernstein, and to a much lesser degree myself, all come from the same European background. There's nothing more American than Copland, Gershwin, Bernstein, really. But it all comes from the Central European Jewish background.
I can name you one more, Irving Berlin.
Indeed. I never knew his real name, but anyway.
Something like Isidore Berlinski or Bellinger.
Yes, I remember now. That's right. Again, extremely American his output.
Yeah.
Coming from Europe. And so in those days, also in the 50s, so most of the Hollywood composers came from Europe. But all of those have the same background. They were Russian, European, or German, Jewish, and they became extremely American. Gershwin sound and Copland sound, it's nothing, Bernstein, nothing more American than that. They absorbed everything, and that's what happened.
I've never spoken to a musician before from South America who has also worked and established a very large career in North America and in Europe, of course, too. But I mention North and South America because the Americas have in common that they have been recipients of immigration for very long times, and sometimes people fleeing oppression, sometimes just immigrating for a better economic life. And we in North America tend not to think of South America that way. When I'm in South America, often I hear people refer to America, not meaning the United States, but meaning the two continents, the whole hemisphere.
right.
And that, well, we know that the term America comes from the Italian sailor Amerigo Vespucci,
Yeah.
and it was named for him, and that Christopher Columbus gave us Columbia and the nation, but also Columbia University and Columbus Avenue, which is between where you and I are speaking. And the influences are extraordinary. You mentioned Guido Santorsola, who was an Italian. All the people who came to Uruguay and to South America, who came to North America, who, for example, Arnold Schoenberg, Rachmaninoff, Dvorak, all these people came to the United States, Toscanini, Richard Strauss for a while,
Yes.
Mahler in a very major way. All of these people are part of our DNA, our musical, artistic, our cultural DNA in the Americas. And I think it's important to include South America because people forget the degree to which it too was influenced by many of the same figures who influenced music in North America.
Absolutely.
But having said that, I think the advantage that the Americas have over the old world is number one, the very large presence of people from Africa. When you look at the piano, and there are the so-called white keys and black keys, and it's unfortunate that they're white and black, but the black keys are the pentatonic scale. And that's a very important influence in the music of African Americans, and perhaps Brazilian blacks too, I don't know, and Haitians, but certainly I do know about North America. And someone once said to me, a black musician once said to me, that Europe was the melody and Africa was the rhythm.
Ah,
When you look at music written in the United States, and even a white gay Jew from Eastern Europe, such as Aaron Copland, experienced fully the rhythmic aspects of American music as presented by mostly people of African origin. And you have been a wonderful proponent of music of the Americas, and I think it's a very important contribution. Clearly, I love your conducting of Dvorak, and I love your conducting of the so-called European masters, but a very important role that you've played in our musical life is, let's call it American music, and by that I mean the whole hemisphere and not just the United States. Was that a mission for you, or was that more a passion and your interest, and you moved on what interested you? How did that happen?
a passion. Yeah, just I love, regardless where the music comes from, was interest. You know, when Columbia University awarded me long time ago the Alice Dixon Award, I was on tour with the American Composers Orchestra, the only tour the orchestra ever made of the East Coast. Organized this tour. The first concert was at the Kennedy Center in Washington. So someone from Columbia University, the dean of the School of Music, came over to Washington to give me this award, which was a great surprise. And the reason to give me the award because of my championship of American music. And I didn't realize, because I didn't consider it because it was American, I considered it because it was music that I loved. And then later on I found out that who proposed me for that award was Otto Lunin. Otto Lunin. Now, not too many people remember. He was a great American composer and teacher at Columbia University. I think he was the dean of the school for a while. And I made a record. I recorded a piece by Lunin and Usachevsky that Bernstein had premiered. I was fascinated by the idea. It was at the time when the computer in the music school of Columbia University took 2 rooms. What today we have in this small box, it took 2 entire rooms. And it was the beginning of electronic music. And Otto Lunin and Vladimir Usachevsky wrote a first electronic piece, of sort, I guess, called Concerto for Tape Recorder and Orchestra, which Bernstein premiered with the New York Philharmonic. And I did the recording. Lunin had become a friend and we were very good colleagues. He was 3 times my age, but he said, you recorded. I was already developing the recording career. But in fact, actually after that, it was my first recording ever. You know, by now I made over 300, but this was my first recording with the Oslo Philharmonic. So we recorded the orchestral part there, and Lunin and Usachevsky added the tape recorder here. And the record became a big success because it was a novelty, first pseudo electronic piece. Then, just as a separate anecdote, I asked Otto Luning, how come from beginning to the middle is use letters and from the middle to then use rehearsal numbers? Also, it's very different writing, different style. Oh yes, he said, because the way we would work together, I wrote the first part and he wrote the second part. Normally, when you have two composers, like two writers, you think they are doing it together, they speak. No, it was first half, second half. Anyway, so I did many premieres of America, and even long after I received that award from Columbia, the Dixon Award, I recorded, for example, most of the orchestral works by Ned Rorem. Ned Rorem, great American composer on the same period. He's still with us. He's 99.
He is, yeah.
Something like that. And I met him at a rehearsal. He said, nobody's playing my music. I said, well, let me look at it. And I recorded the 3 symphonies, most of the concertos, and so on. I recorded, so mostly recordings, but also in concerts, Peter Manning. I recorded the 9th Symphony, which is a masterpiece. It was just reissued. And there are many others. William Schumann, I did a lot of his music, including the Ives orchestrated by Schumann, Variations on America, which is a piece Ives wrote for organ. And Schumann orchestrated brilliantly. The piece is as much Schumann as Ives. And I recall
Schumann having been the first president of Lincoln Center when Lincoln Center was being created in the 1960s.
That's
Maestro,
right.
and I'm going to call you Maestro. As you know, with all things, whether it's union contracts and rehearsals or whatever, at a certain point we have to pause because IDAGIO is presenting a live concert pretty soon. So I do want to tell listeners that you, as all of my guests do, provided a listening list of music and performers who inspire you. You gave Charles Ives Symphony No. 4, conducted by Stokovsky, and then 3 Russian composers, Tchaikovsky's Hamlet Overture, conducted by Stokovsky, Glazunov's The Seasons, conducted by Yevgeny Svetlanov, and Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, conducted by Fritz Reiner. If you can tell me in a couple of moments why 3 Russian composers?
Sure. I'm very close to all Slavic music, which includes Dvorak, who was Czech. Somehow, even though I didn't hear much music until I was 8 or 9, it's in my blood, I guess. So that's part of that reason. The Ives context to Stokowski, I became acquainted with that music. So they inspired me in many ways. The Glazunov, because Svetlanov is an incredible conductor, that performance is late. Reiner's Scheherazade, because it's, even though I recorded it myself later on, it's very inspiring, amazing performance. And then let me go back to technique. He used technique like this. The players, one time a player in the Pittsburgh Symphony, when he was in Pittsburgh, used a telescope to watch him. He was fired after that. But with that, he obtained the most amazing results. So all 4 and many more have been great inspirations to me throughout my career.
So I also added from IDAGIO's catalog recordings of your music, some of which you conduct and other people have conducted, but you, as you mentioned, have more than 300 recordings, not just of your own music, but I want listeners to explore that as well. I am just going to mention that next week I have an artist who you and I both admire very much, is soprano Carol Farley. And Maestro José Serebrier, I want to thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion. I feel good when I learn. I mentioned at the beginning that you inspire me. I've never spoken to you before, but now I know why, and I thank you.
I thank you. You are one of the most erudite people in the whole world about music, cooking, and many other subjects, totally unrelated, sometimes related. It was a wonderful conversation. I learned a great deal from listening to you.
The left hand of God.
So much. Right, left hand, yes.
Okay. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank
to
you.